Sir Liam Fox, thank you, sir, for joining us. Privileged to have you here, the former Defense Minister of the United Kingdom. Sir Liam, the dais is yours, and we welcome hearing from you.
To be here today, I think it's important that amongst all the important issues that we're discussing, we take time specifically to focus on the number one security threat that Europe is facing today, which is the Russian invasion of a sovereign and democratic nation in Europe itself. It's a situation which has chilling lessons for us both in how we got here and how we need to behave in the future. President Trump is currently being frustrated by Putin's perverse games as he tries to avoid any realistic solution to the conflict. The President shouldn't feel alone. There's a pattern of behaviour here where the hopes and aspirations of the free world come face to face with the violent, immoral behaviour of brutal tyranny. President George W. Bush said that he looked into Putin's eyes and saw a soul. Unfortunately, Putin looked into his and saw a KGB file number. Once KGB, always KGB. Then, following Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, President Barack Obama decided on his reset policy to try to do business with Russia. Putin gratefully pocketed the offer and in 2014 occupied Crimea, part of Ukraine's sovereign territory. And when he saw then the pusillanimous response from the West, he decided he could also have further parts of Ukraine, and so invaded the country in February 2022, resulting in the death of over 13,000 Ukrainian civilians alongside 70,000 troops, with 120,000 injured, and not to mention the more than 120,000 Russians who have died for no purpose other than Putin's vanity. Day after day, the unnecessary violence, suffering and death continues. Babies, children, the elderly, and innumerable young soldiers are slaughtered in a war that none of them sought. Now, the grim reality is dawning that no amount of hope or optimism for the future can disguise the fact that Putin is a liar, who murders political opponents at home, and whose intelligence services murder opponents abroad, including in the United Kingdom. He is at best an abuser of international law and norms of behaviour, and at worst a war criminal. He is gangster-in-chief of the world's most dangerous thugocracy. The Ukrainians understand this more than most of us. After all, in one of the most blatant acts of betrayal in recent history, Ukraine agreed to sign away the nuclear weapons it had inherited in the breakup of the Soviet Union, in return for reassurances about their security. In the Budapest Memorandum of December 1994, Ukraine signed up to the NPT, joining Russia, the US, the UK, China and France. And remember, the treaty gave Ukraine assurances that its independence and sovereignty, according to its existing borders, would be respected by the other signatories. They would, under the terms of the agreement, refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine. They also undertook to refrain from economic coercion of Ukraine in order to secure advantage of any kind, particularly in their own interests. They went even further in agreeing to seek immediate UN Security Council action to help Ukraine should they become a victim of an act of aggression. Of course, the truth is that while the agreement was drawn up to resemble a NATO-like guarantee, they were carefully drafted to be nothing of the sort. It's little wonder then that President Zelensky now seeks much firmer security guarantees as part of any peace agreement, especially from his Western allies, recognizing, as he does, that Putin's every assurance on security is a profanity, and any signature on is totally dispensable and easily discarded when Putin feels that his moment of future expansion is right. In the free world, we are hardwired to seek to preserve our freedom with concepts of rule of law, including international law and universal human rights. But we have to accept that there is a very different worldview from those who believe in none of these. Many Western leaders have learned the hard way that there can be no long-term accommodation with Putin, as he'll simply ditch any promise, relinquish any agreement, and abandon any of his faux friendships when it suits his purpose. Of course, there's no shame whatsoever in seeking peace and reconciliation. But when it comes to Vladimir Putin, decent people sooner or later end up in the same place. But how did we come to this tragic place, and what do we do now? First, we need to understand that the war in Ukraine is primarily the result of inexcusable Russian aggression. But it also represents a failure of Western deterrence. The sanctions regime that was introduced in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea should have been introduced after the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. Too little, too late meant that Putin drew the conclusion that he would be able to have further incursions without serious Western measures being implemented. On top of that, there was a failure to understand Putin's motivations, driven by ideology, a hatred of Western values and influence, and he was fed information that he wanted to hear. Putin believed that any limited short-term consequences would be justified by the geopolitical gains that a victory in Ukraine would give him. Of course, the Zelensky regime did not collapse in a few days, as he had been told. Flag-waving supporters did not run out to welcome Russian tanks in Ukraine. But by the time that became apparent, Putin was on an irreversible course. The Kremlin learned valuable lessons from the partial and strategically ineffective sanctions of 2014, and the way that sanctions were introduced in 2022 actually prevented a potentially catastrophic flight of capital out of Russia, a situation which was augmented by Russian capital controls and the high interest rates which remain in place today. And just imagine a base rate of 21% with an inflation rate of 11%, and how well that would go down in Western democratic states today. I don't believe that Putin will change his behavior even if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine, which he will see merely as a strategic pause while he destabilizes Moldova, Georgia, or Romania. There is therefore a need to maintain longer-term and better focused sanctions to prevent Russia's ability to wage war in future. Remember that in the Cold War, the inability of the Russian economy to maintain its military budget was one of the main reasons behind the Gorbachev revolution and the fall of the Soviet Union itself. So sanctions policy should be focused on further weakening the Russian position that has resulted from its transition into a wartime economy. Russia remains technically backward and dependent upon high-tech imports, which will limit the ability of its non-war components to generate sufficient income. It already has a labour shortage, worsened by the increased numbers who have been pulled into the armed forces for the war in Ukraine or weapons productions. The high levels of government expenditure and the bending of fiscal rules is unsustainable in the long term. And while domestic investment in Russia has flourished, when Russia's wealthy have had no alternative investment destinations, these opportunities will increasingly dry up. Future sanctions policy must be aimed at maximizing capital outflows from Russia exacerbating its labour crisis and limiting its ability to become technologically and thus economically competitive in the medium term. We need a comprehensive plan and, perhaps more importantly, the unity of purpose in the free world to see it through. Then we come to the topical but thorny issue of Russia's overseas assets. Of the approximately $300 billion of Russian assets frozen in the aftermath of the Ukraine invasion, the vast majority are held in Europe. So far, we have used the interest on these assets to assist Ukraine, but only in a small way. It won't be enough. First, there is the inevitable cost of rebuilding Ukraine after the conflict. Of course, we know that Russia has a duty to make reparations for its illegal invasion and occupation, its widespread physical destruction and the human cost. But let's face it, it is virtually unthinkable that Putin's Russia will produce any money voluntarily for this purpose. So Russian assets held abroad may be the only way to ensure that Russia pays for its actions. And a second scenario which amplifies the first would be if the United States scaled back or stopped its support for Ukraine. More funding would be needed to fill the gap in order to help Ukraine fight for its life. And my message to our US friends would be that Iran, China and North Korea will continue to fight on the side of Russia. On whose side should history record that the United States cast its lot? I've always believed that there were huge risks in moving from the freezing of assets to the seizing of assets. But where international law, sovereignty, basic humanity are disregarded so blatantly by Putin's Kremlin, I fear we would be both naive and ineffective if we were to be bound by abstract legal arguments in the face of humanitarian disaster. I'm sorry that none of these are happy messages, but we have to deal with the world as we find it, not how we would like it to be. Aggression must be resisted, freedom must be defended, and our values must be championed. Wishful thinking is a poor basis for foreign or security policy. And the future is watching us and what we do today. Thank you.
Outstanding. Thank you, Sir Liam. Do we have a question?
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Mr. Minister,
Speak up.
for the presentation. Yeah? Thank you, Mr. Minister, for the presentation. I'm Marta Dade from Albania, and last week there was a very important meeting of the Political Council between EU countries and larger, with the participation of Turkey, Azerbaijan, Armenia, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and of course Zelensky was also participating. So the European Union and the main leaders of it reaffirmed their determination to assist and help and continue with the support for Ukraine. Do you think that the European Union is drawing lessons from the past, as you mentioned, Crimea, and are you optimistic that they are doing their job? Because we know the region of the Western Balkans is in the vicinity of Ukraine, and of course people are concerned about this conflict, which is going to the end, because there were voices that it would not last. And practically it is lasting and it's becoming even more serious. Of course we are doing the job in Albania and other countries in the eastern side of NATO, but do you think the European Union itself is doing enough by, of course, adding some more of the sanctions to Russia? Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. It's an excellent question. When the sanctions were imposed in 2014, Russia moved most of its assets to Europe rather than the United States because they believed that there would not be sufficient European solidarity in the face of Russian aggression. And the thing that does make me feel optimistic is how solid we have been right across the West in dealing with Russia's aggression. We've so far spent between Europe and, broader Europe, not just the EU, but including UK, Norway, Turkey, we've spent 282 billion supporting Ukraine. There's 300 billion more assets sitting there if we want to use them. It will take quite a degree of political will to do that. But I think what has been encouraging has been the fact that there's been such an understanding that our failure of deterrence up till this point cannot continue. And faced with the necessary defense of freedom and rule of law and democracy, this is the time we actually have to stand together. Because I do believe, as I was saying, that there's a growing awareness that Putin will not stop. Anything that gives Putin reassurances that he can have a strategic pause but start again at a later date will simply guarantee further instability and death and destruction on the European continent. This is the point at which we have to make a stand. And so far, it's been extremely good. I just hope that the United States doesn't decide for whatever reason that it doesn't want to be part of the coalition that stands against tyranny and aggression in support of international law and freedom.
Thank you. Very quickly, if you could, please.
Yes, Sir Lamb. I'm Senator Corlețean, ex-Foreign Minister of Romania, working hard at the time with my colleague, counterpart and friends William Hague, and for a certain period with the Defense Secretary Michael Fallon. Because you have mentioned also Romania plus the Republic of Moldova as possible items of interest of Russia, I entirely agree with your assessment. We know the profile. We don't have any fundamental expectations about possible fundamental changes on the profile of power in Kremlin, starting with Putin. So this is why I and we consider that we should continue to do and to continue to promote our assessment and position. It was me that I proposed on 3rd of March 2014 in Brussels. Cathy Ashton was the High Representative chairing the meeting of the Foreign Ministers of the EU. And I proposed not to express serious concerns, but to condemn Russia for the crime of aggression and the illegal annexation of Crimea, and to continue to do our job because we know what is the profile of Russia. This is why this year we will adopt at the European level a special tribunal for assuring the accountability for the crime of aggression, and we need to continue. But the key element from our perspective in Bucharest is to ensure and to assure and to work hard that the transatlantic relationship will continue to remain solid. And this is a long-term process, and this is the key element for us. Thank you.
When I was the UK's Defence Secretary and Robert Gates was the American Defence Secretary, we used to have a routine at NATO which you might describe as bad cop and worse cop, when one would talk about the implications of European states not maintaining their defence budgets. And that was augmented by the fact that we would say, in the long term, you can't expect American taxpayers to continue to carry the burden of European defence as well as defence in Asia and the Americas and so on. The European nations didn't take notice of that in the first Trump term. They've taken notice of it in the second term, and that's a good thing. I think it will strengthen the alliance as a whole, that European nations carry a bigger share of their burden. My worry is that it's not just about money, it's about what they do with the money and about how capacity and capability is built, rather than countries trying to pretend that they can have full spectrum defence capabilities on a small budget. But I think it's key politically, as you mentioned, that we don't allow Putin to develop any cracks around the periphery. of our wider alliance, which is what he does try to do. He's tried to create an arc of instability around NATO, from the high north to the Baltics, to the Balkans, to the Caucasus, and he will continue to do that because his behaviour pattern doesn't change. And what I would say, perhaps on a slightly optimistic note, is that people say that Russia has survived the sanctions intact. It hasn't. There are big cracks appearing in the Russian economy, and the longer the conflict goes on, the bigger the contradictions inside the Russian economy become. It's had growth because it has pumped money against its own fiscal rules into the armaments and into the armed forces. That always produces growth if you're looking at technical OECD definitions of growth. But in the longer term, it's unsustainable. And we must not become fatigued at the length of the time this conflict has taken, because this is an existential battle, and we have to win it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Quickly, if you could.
Thank you. Your Excellency, how do you see the Chinese position in this conflict? Would you think that China would like to see a peace soon in the European battle, or prefer that it perdure in time?
China would like to see the West weakened. It would like to see the alliance that we have fractured, because that's in the long-term interests of China. And while our biggest weakness is that we tend to think in electoral terms of 4 or 5 years, and Putin doesn't have to bother about his electoral cycle. The Chinese don't think in electoral cycles at all. So if they can have a gradual fracturing, a gradual weakening, a gradual tearing apart of the intellectual and political coherence that has made the West strong and wealthy, then it will do so. Not overtly, in the way that Russia does, because they're much more subtle than the gangster regime in Moscow, but the danger is there, even if it's presented in a more subtle form.
Thank you. Sorry for my English. I don't know if I can ask my question in French, but I will try in English. Contrary to what I heard from every presenter, from the African perspective, we are seeing the influence of Russia increasing, and the influence of Europe decreasing, and the economic in Europe decreasing, the inflation increasing in Europe. So when you say that we have to keep going, fighting, is it the only way to solve this issue? We have a new threat with China, for instance. You have a new threat with, Cuba and some African country under influence of Russia. So do you think keeping this war, feeding this war, is in the advantage of Europe and even Ukraine with all those deaths and so on? Because since maybe the beginning of the war in 2023, they said that in 1 year Russia will collapse, in 2 years Russian economy will collapse, but it's not what we have seen all over the world. So,
well, there are two questions there, if I may. The first is that we are not feeding the war. We are defending a sovereign and democratic state against a brutal tyranny that tries to impose its will. And let me give you an African analogy to that. Putin says they are allowed to own Ukraine because it was once part of the Soviet Union. Supposing France turned around tomorrow and said, we want to occupy Algeria because it was once part of France. What do you think the international reaction would be to that? So let's be very clear that this is a colonial action by Russia. And it surprises me that a number of African countries who complain about the legacy of colonialism are not more vocal in their criticism of what is a clearly colonial policy being operated by today's Kremlin. The second part of your question, which I have much more sympathy with, is what has been the Western alternative to China's Belt and Road policy? And the answer is pathetically little. I was the UK's candidate to be the Director General of the World Trade Organization, and I felt that one of the changes we needed to make, particularly for African countries, was to call it the World Trade and Investment Organization, because one of the things that we could do is to help African countries become much more attractive to foreign direct investment and become masters of their own destiny by that method. And we need to do much more in the West to have a strategic alternative to Chinese Belt and Road that's been missing from our diplomatic armory in recent times. And one of the ways that we can do that is to actually allow African countries to develop in a way that makes them more attractive to the massive amount of international capital that could be helping to take Africa forward in a way that is in line with what the countries want and not what Beijing wants, and not leaving African countries with a legacy of debt and useless infrastructure, which is what a lot of them are finding they're left with Belt and Road.
Outstanding. You always give us your best, Sir Liam. Thank you.